Good morning. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. It's 9 o'clock on the dot. We got about 45 minutes. Daniel has 12 chapters. We've been trying to go through about a chapter a week. We started chapter 11 last week and got through about 32 of the 45 verses. We're going to try to finish up chapter 11 today and start chapter 12. I'm trying to be realistic. If we don't get through all of chapter 12 before the end of class, when I go to my office this week, I'll open up my camera and record the rest of the book, and I'll put it on the same YouTube link that all these classes have been on. So I don't want to rush through and just say, well, figure out the last 15 verses yourself. So depending on how far, wherever we get and we stop, I'll pick that up and finish that this week, and you'll have the notes so you can talking about. In Daniel chapter 11, you have about the first 4 verses that talk about the king that is presently the king at the time of Daniel when he has this vision. And then it says there's going to be 3 more kings. We talked about which Persian kings those were. Then it said there's going to be a 4th, which is richer than them all. That was talking about who in Esther is called Ahasuerus, or Xerxes is another name that he's referenced. And to answer the question that you asked, Con, which one did Alexander the Great fight against? You had Ahasuerus, then his son was, I believe, Darius the Great. And then Darius III, so I guess it'd be 3 more people down, is who Alexander fought. Now, there may be some other kings interspersed there. You can go and do some more research if you want. But Darius III, I believe, is the one who fought against Alexander. So he's not mentioned really in Daniel chapter 11. But you have these 3 Persian kings that were going to come after the one who was a king at the time of Daniel, the 4th one who was richer. And then it jumps to talk about Alexander the Great in, I believe, about verse 4. And it talks about Alexander's kingdom being broken up between his 4 generals, okay? These are the 4 divisions, okay? And you had the king of the south, which was Ptolemy, and that's why the Ptolemies or Ptolemaic Empire, and Seleucus, who became the king of the north, the area of Syria, and that's why you see it called the Seleucid Empire. These were 2 of those leaders. And the rest of Daniel chapter 11 is talking about the history leading up to the time of the 14 verses dedicated to Antiochus Epiphanes, okay, who would be the one who would desolate. So this is the 4 regions, okay. If you want this PowerPoint, it's very small. Just email me, and I may even attach it to the next email if you want this. So these are the 4 kingdoms, and these 2 become the focus of the rest of the chapter, all right. And so this is a summary that I'll send it in an email. And so this really is just the world history that deals with which verses it's being referenced. We made it all the way down to the bottom. And verses 21 through 35 talk about Antiochus the 4th Epiphanes. He's the one that's the little horn earlier in the chapter, earlier in the book. And I believe it's probably chapter 8. Yeah, I believe it'd be chapter 8. And this is where we kind of got halfway through. So we went through verses 21 and we stopped about 32. Let's go ahead and pick up and read starting in Daniel 11:29, just to kind of catch up with the context of where we were last week and leaving off in verse 32. So Daniel 11:29. At the appointed time he shall return. This is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. He will go towards the south. This is referencing, we discussed, he went down towards Egypt to try to go and conquer them again. But it shall not be like the former or the latter, for ships from Cyprus, where did we say that was? A nation that's growing in power. Rome. This is the nation of Rome, okay? Shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. This is a story last week where he went down and Rome came, and Antiochus went up to shake the Roman commander's hand, and he handed him basically a surrender document and said, I'm not going to shake your hand until you sign this document of surrender. And he said, well, I need to think about it a little bit. And the Roman general took his staff and drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and said, you've got enough time until you step out of that circle, give me a decision. So Antiochus said, okay, I surrender, and then the Roman general probably smiled and shook his hand. And so Antiochus left and went back up through, and he went through Palestine, and as that verse says, returned in a rage against the holy covenant, okay? So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. He showed favor to the people, the Jews, who would reject the law of Moses, right, and begin to follow him, be unfaithful to God. Verse 31, and forces shall be mustered by him. They shall defile the sanctuary fortress. They shall take away the daily sacrifices. Okay, those are the sacrifices that happen twice a day. You can read about that back in Exodus. Okay, and place there the abomination of desolation. What did we say the abomination of desolation was? It was an idol. Yeah, they'd set up idol in God's temple, and they sacrificed unclean animals, pigs, on the altar of burnt offering, okay, in the temple. In Matthew 24:15, Jesus will say, let the reader understand, this is the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. He's saying just like during the time of Antiochus, when they offered pigs on God's altar, Rome is going to do the same thing, okay? And that happened in AD 70. But in context, this is referencing what happened during Antiochus' day. Okay, verse 32. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. All right, verse 33 is where we should pick up from last week. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. If you want to get, I've mentioned this a few times, if you want to find out more information, historical information about what happened during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, that's what 1st and 2nd Maccabees are written about. They're historical accounts, they're not inspired. But you can read through 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees, and in my notes, I have the section, if you want to. A lot of these works that I reference, like Herodotus and Cicero, they're all free on the internet. If I want to read, or Josephus, I normally just get on Google and search Josephus, book 10, whatever, Daniel, or Josephus on Daniel or something, and it'll come up and you can read it for free. You don't have to go out and spend a bunch of money on those. The real old works are normally public domain, so they're free. So in verse 33, it's talking about the people who understand will instruct many. And in verse 32, it talked about those people who are faithful as well. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he will corrupt with flattery. Antiochus would corrupt these people who were Jews who wanted to do what? If they were, he basically came in and said many things like, don't circumcise your baby boys like the law of Moses, made it illegal. He said, cut off the sacrifices, you can't keep the Sabbath, all these things. And the people who would reject God's word and follow with him, well, how do you think he treated them? Yeah, really well, right? Okay. And then you have these other people who were wise, verse 32, the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits, verse 32. Some people think that's referencing the people who rebelled against Antiochus, like Judas Maccabeus and his brothers. Verse 33, those are the people who understand, the faithful shall instruct many. Yet for many days they will fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. This is basically saying the people who are faithful to God are going to face what? Yeah, persecution. Okay. Isn't that sort of typical? I mean, throughout the Bible, whenever you have an evil ruler that comes in and persecutes the people who are faithful, what's going to happen to the faithful? Yeah, I mean, they're going to face persecution. They might even die, okay? But throughout, whether it's in Daniel or whether it's in Revelation, whether it's really any point in time in history, what's the message? If someone persecutes you for being faithful to God, what's going to happen even if you have to die for it? You're going to go to paradise, right? You're going to receive a crown of life, right? And you see that sort of same message all throughout Daniel 11 and Daniel 12, okay? Verse 34, now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join them by intrigue. Verse 35, and some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them and purify them and make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. All right. Now, throughout this book, we've seen this phrase, the time of the end, right? What has it always been referring to? No, not the end of time. I think, honestly, that's one of the misunderstandings that premillennialists have when they come to this, is they read a passage like this and say, it says the time of the end, and they think that must be referencing what? Yeah, the end of the world. That's right, the end of the earth, right? And to be honest with you, you even see sort of Jesus' disciples have this problem in Matthew 24. Jesus, they say, look how beautiful the temple stones are. And Jesus says, not one stone is going to be left upon another, right? And in Mark's account, it actually says, look how beautiful these stones are. And Jesus says, what's going to happen? He says it's going to be thrown down, but then he contrasts that with the end of the world, right? So even in the first century, to the disciples, they thought the destruction of the temple meant what? End of the world, right? And Jesus says, no, it's, and I can probably, if I was in their position, I can understand that misunderstanding. Judaism for 1,500 years had been what? The main religion, God's people. I mean, they have a temple. This is where God dwells on earth, right? Even though we know God doesn't dwell in temples made with hands. But to them, it's where God's presence was, right? And so you find out that God's going to destroy this, and you're saying, wait a minute, I don't quite follow, right? So back here in this text, it talks about these people who suffer persecution, the ones who are faithful, are going to be refined, purified, made white until the time of the end. This is talking about the time of the end of the what? What's Daniel having? A vision, right? Into the law is it's coming. These people who are going to be persecuted all the way up until chapter 12, which I take chapter 12 to be talking about AD 70, the destruction of the temple, okay? But these people are refined and purified. That language is really common. It's not only in the Old Testament, but it's used in the New Testament, right? Let me find some verses. I have a bunch here. 1 Peter talks about it in chapters, I think, 1 and chapter 4. It talks about being refined, right? It's throughout the Old Testament prophets. I've got a list in the notes if you want to go through and look at those. But in this verse, I think the overall gist is the people who are persecuted, right? Some of them are going to turn away from the covenant and be unfaithful to God. Some of them are going to be faithful and be persecuted. And even if they have to die, they're going to be refined. They're going to be purified, okay? Until the time of the end. I think it's talking about the time of the end of this vision. Just like in Daniel chapter 8, it talked about, similar to this, remember in Daniel 8, it talked about Persia and Greece and the 4 generals, and it talked about this same guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, rising to power, and it used the same language in Daniel 8:17. It said this, "So he came near where I stood. When he came, I was afraid, and I fell on my face." This is Daniel speaking. "And he said to me, 'Understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end.'" In context, it's the end of Antiochus Epiphanes and his rule, okay? Daniel 8:19 says the same thing. So the end of the world is not the context in here. Throughout the book, you've had visions that have been stretching from the time of Babylon to what nation? Rome, yeah. Every vision has been stretching from Babylon. The furthest is to Rome, right? And I think Daniel 12 is going to be maybe the furthest because it's all the way up to AD 70, and then it mentions about Rome being sort of conquered, which would come later. Okay. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. 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 So until the time of the end, okay? So remember, Daniel's back in the days of Persia, the king right now. And he's given this vision, but it is not until the time of the end of the vision. The end of the vision, which is going to be hundreds of years later, 160, 168, when Antiochus Epiphanes is going to come. And then it says, because it is still for the appointed time. This is still appointed way in the future. This isn't something that Daniel's even going to see in his lifetime. At the end of Daniel 12, it's going to say that basically, Daniel, you're going to go to your rest, but it talks about the end of his days, right? If we get to the end of Daniel, we'll get to look at that. But this is talking about, throughout the book, the end is never talking about the end of time. That's one of the reasons if you discuss with a premillennialist and they take you to Daniel, if you don't know Daniel, you're going to have some hard time explaining a lot of this, right? Okay, look at Daniel chapter 12 and verse 7. Daniel 12:7 speaks of, let's see, at the very end of the verse. "It shall be for a time, times, and half a time, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered." Who's been the context of this throughout the book? The Jews, right? In Daniel chapter 9, Daniel's praying to God and saying, when can we leave Babylon and go back to Jerusalem, right? And he starts having this series of visions that we've looked at in 9, 10, 11, and all the way up to 12, okay? So we're talking about the time of this vision of Antiochus, and then as we move further, we're going to see what I believe is a transition from Antiochus into Rome. Hopefully we'll get through that today. And then Rome becomes chapter 12. Now, as we go a little further, you'll see there are some people that are that argue and say, well, we're talking about Antiochus all the way through the end of chapter 12. I personally don't hold that view, but I think there's a lot of things later in this chapter that don't fit with Antiochus. So we'll try to get there in a second. I have a lot more in my notes, but for time's sake, you can read that later. And so, okay, from here, from verse 35, 36, through the end of chapter 12, there's a lot of disagreement. Some people, mostly I would say those who are premillennial, hold the idea that the Antichrist is in view, right? They would say this is talking about the Antichrist at the end of time. Number one, the biggest problem with that is it doesn't fit the what? Context, right? There's nothing that shows a jump from Antiochus Epiphanes 2,000 plus years into the future talking about an Antichrist, right? This is the same little horn of Daniel chapter 8, which is described in the same way of a ruler that came out of Alexander and one of his generals and their descendants, right? So I think it's easy to reject that view. Daniel 10:14, it talks about your people, the Jewish people. After the AD 70, when God destroyed the temple, 40 years after Jesus, has God dealt with Israel any differently than he's dealt with all people? No. No. Galatians 3:28, the gospel took away that differentiation between what? Yeah, Jew and Gentile, right? Galatians 6, maybe it's 16, talks about you are Christians, you're the Israel of God, right? So this idea that it's referencing physical Israel all the way forward in the time of the Antichrist, I just don't think fits the context at all, right? Some people think that Antiochus Epiphanes is still being discussed. I have a lot more notes as to why I don't think that makes sense, but the main thing is that in verses 40 through 45, the rest of the chapter, Antiochus never fits with any of the things that are discussed. Rome has just basically made Antiochus surrender, and he's going to have a couple more battles, but he's really, I wouldn't describe him as the king of the north anymore because he's been conquered, right? And later, what I believe is talking about Rome at the end of the chapter, that's going to fit much better with the world history. You know how we've been going through and saying, okay, what does this mean? And we've looked at this chart. World history fits perfect with this. Well, world history only through about verse 35 matches. And then from there, it shifts and really fits with Rome. It doesn't fit with Assyria anymore, okay? I have two other views. One other view. Herod is in view. Some people think that this is Herod that's being discussed as the king of the north, but he doesn't fit a lot of the things in there, right? And then the fourth, which is that the king of the north now begins to be discussed as Rome. That's the view I hold right now. Of course, I think it's the correct view, because if I wouldn't hold it if I didn't think it was the correct view. All right. So Rome has just defeated Antiochus, and I would say they're viewed as the king of the north now. Okay. I have a lot more things in my notes. Some people say, well, how can you jump 150 years forward to discussing, the second triumvirate or set of three rulers of Rome? Well, earlier in the chapter, how many years did we jump from Persia to Alexander? 150. It's the exact same period of time, right? God's not really concerned with giving you a checklist of all these rulers. He's basically just focusing on the big things. He focuses on the Persian rulers at the time of Daniel, jumps to Alexander, goes through in, 5 through 20, 15 verses, goes through like 14 kings, just to get to the point that he wants to discuss, right? So I think it's talking about Daniel, which also I believe fits the context of the book. Has Rome been a pretty frequent someone that shows up in the book already? In Daniel 2, who's the fourth kingdom? In Daniel 7, who's the fourth beast? Rome, okay? So I think it fits with the context. A lot more reasons that I think it makes sense in the notes. So going from 36 through 45, I'm going to approach it as if it's Rome. If someone else thinks it's Antiochus, they're going to have a different interpretation of it, but I think it's Rome. So Daniel 11:36. Then the king shall do according to his own will. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god. He shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. So whoever's being discussed, it says they're going to be a blasphemous person, right? This fits pretty much every oppressor of God's people ever. In the Old Testament, in Ezekiel, you see this type of language about the king of Tyre. You see this language about the king of Babylon. You see this language in Revelation about Rome, right? So this is really common Old Testament language. I have lots of references in the notes. This is just one example. Isaiah 13 and 14, speaking about the king of Babylon, this is what God says about the king of Babylon. You have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Now, do you think Nebuchadnezzar or Babylon ever said those exact words? Maybe. I think what it's likely pointing at is some of these Old Testament kings were what? Starts with an A and ends in, arrogant, right? There was a lot of these kings who were very arrogant, right? And so by the way they lived their life, they basically were sending this message to God, I don't need you. I'm just as good as you are, right? I'm like the Most High. That's said of Babylon in Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, said of the king of Tyre. And here, I think it's just language that you see here, and then you also see it in Revelation chapter 13, I believe it is, the first 7 verses, which is talking about the beast who is Rome, the beast of Revelation, okay? So it's interesting, you see so many parallels between Daniel and Revelation, and here you have this really language of, hey, this is a really arrogant ruler that Revelation uses of Rome. So it's kind of interesting. Look at verse 37. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall exalt himself above them all. Let's read all the way through 39 together. But in their place, in the place of these gods, okay, that his fathers or his ancestors have worshipped, in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses, a God which his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory. He shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. Many writers have said that one of the things that was different about Rome, and you could probably argue this point, is that all Rome cared about was power and war and taking it. Now you could say, well, Alexander the Great did the same thing, right? But it seems like another thing at the end, verse 39, let's see. Act against the strongest forces. Look at the very end. And he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. One of the things that commentators say in Roman history is that Rome would conquer. They would rule by conquering and then leaving a king in place. And his job would be to collect taxes and send it to Rome, right? This is like they did with Antiochus's father when he was defeated by Rome. And they said, hey, your duty is now just to be a tax collector for us, right? And so what you have is it seems like these things would fit the idea that all Rome cared about was conquering others, right, and ruling them, okay? Look at verse 40. Now this is where if somebody takes the idea that this is still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes and not Rome, there's a lot of problems because Antiochus never did any of these things, at least that we have in history. And we've got pretty extensive history in these writers that we've referenced before, like the Maccabean period, look at it as a historical book, not inspired, right? But look at verse 40. At the time of the end, okay, the end of the what? The vision, right? Once again, premillennial guys will go to this and say, hey, this is talking about the end of time. This is what leads them to say things like, if they think the end of the world was now, they'd say, well, the king of the north would be, oh, well, Russia, right? Who's the big power over in, you'd think, oh, Russia, right? Well, who's the king of the south? Well, maybe we're south, or maybe it's talking about that. When you have that idea, that's what it leads you to. If you start wrong, you're going to end up wrong, right? At that time, the king of the south, Egypt, who's been the king of the south throughout this whole context? Okay, the Ptolemies, right? At the time, at the end, the king of the south shall attack him. Okay, he's talking about the king of the north. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, with many ships. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. Okay? Egypt never went up and attacked Antiochus IV, right? After Rome conquered Antiochus, here's kind of what Roman history looked like after that. If we can get the PowerPoint. Oh, sorry, buddy. Clicking for you. So this is a summary of some Roman history, okay? I found this on the internet. So Rome, after the Maccabean revolt, the Jews freed themselves from Antiochus. About 100 years they ruled themselves. And then in the 60s they were conquered, I believe it was by Pompey, okay? If you hear the word triumvirate, it just means 3 people who ruled together. So the first one was Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Crassus. Crassus was he was the richest guy in Rome. The other 2 guys were generals. And Crassus, I guess, was maybe intimidated by these 2 war generals, even though he was rich. So he wanted to go fight a war himself, and he did, and guess what happened? He died. And then Julius Caesar and Pompey sort of were jealous of each other, and Pompey fled to Egypt. And when Pompey got there, he got assassinated by the ruler of Egypt because he thought, hey, Julius Caesar is going to appreciate me assassinating this guy, Pompey. So Julius Caesar comes to Egypt, and he meets Cleopatra. And he had a son with Cleopatra. He brings her back to Rome, and the people hate him for it because they think she's bewitched him. And also, Julius Caesar's first wife didn't really appreciate that very much, you know. Hey, I got a new wife and a new kid, and she's like, and so this son that he had with Cleopatra now becomes technically the heir to what? The throne, right? And when Julius Caesar had eliminated all the threats to Rome, he basically returned. He has, and then in the, 44 maybe or 33, I forget, he's assassinated, okay? That ends the first triumvirate, and you have the second triumvirate, which is 3 guys. And that's going to be Octavian, which is a nephew of Julius Caesar, I believe. I can't remember if it's a nephew or not. But I know it was Octavian. You had Lepidus and Mark Antony, okay? So in this history, you've got Mark Antony, okay? This is Octavian and Mark Antony, all right? And so they're trying to, make peace, but also rule the kingdom together. Lepidus had already been exiled, and Mark Antony didn't want any part of it. But technically what happens here is, this says, let's share the Roman power between the two of us. And Mark Antony says, okay, you govern the west while I govern the east. So Mark Antony goes to Syria, and when he gets there, he meets somebody from Egypt who had to come up and explain their participation maybe in the assassination of Pompey. And she comes on this big barge, and guess who it is? It's Cleopatra, right? And obviously she was, whenever Julius Caesar died, she fled and went back to Egypt, right? So now she goes up to meet Mark Antony. He's supposed to be questioning her, and what do you think he does? Falls in lust with her. That's what he fell in lust with her. So she becomes his lover, right? They're not married, okay? So then Mark Antony goes back, and Octavian, the ruler with him, says, hey, marry my sister, Octavia, okay? So Mark Antony marries Octavia, so now you should have peace between these 2 guys, right? Well, then what did Mark Antony do? He actually goes to Cleopatra later and says, actually, I want to marry you now. I'll divorce my first wife, okay? So when Mark Antony marries Cleopatra, he divorced who? Who was the sister of? You think that made him very happy? No. So he gets furious, and he says, we're going to go destroy. He basically, Octavian declared war on Cleopatra, who's ruling over Egypt, all right? So this is the battle of Actium, where we're going to look at in a second. But now Mark Antony and Cleopatra are in Egypt. They're ruling Egypt. She's the queen, and he's ruling with her, right? And so this says, how dare he divorce my sister and marry a foreigner? He's no longer an ally. I must declare war on Cleopatra. And this is 31 BC. It's called the Battle of Actium, if you look at it in history, okay? I have a map here in a second. So in 31 BC, Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, where they were forced to flee to Alexandria, all right? Now, this is what the Battle of Actium looked like. This is 31 BC, okay? 30 years before Christ, all right? So this is up in, if you look at this map over here, right? This is Asia Minor, all right? So this is over in Greece, the area of Greece, right? So you can see this is not down in Egypt. This is the Battle of Actium. Octavian and his forces are in, that's red, right? Red? Green? Red? Red, okay. You've had problems with colors, so I didn't want to say red, and you guys laugh at me, but now you're laughing anyway. And this is supposed to be the Mark Antony and Cleopatra's army, right? Now, in the verse, I said all that to say this. In verse 40, it says, the king of the south shall attack him. After Octavian declared war, Mark Antony and Cleopatra didn't wait in Egypt. They came up to fight here in this area of Greece. That's Asia Minor, where all the churches of Asia are. So this is Asia Minor, and that's over in the Grecian area, right? So they come up to fight against Octavian, okay? And in verse 40, it says, the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and many ships, okay? This is, I believe, referencing this battle, okay? And I've got some notes that I'll read here. And then after it's verse 40, it says, with many ships, he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. After Octavian defeats Cleopatra and Mark Antony here, Mark Antony and Cleopatra actually fled. They retreated and went down through the ocean down to Alexandria in Egypt, right? Where Mark Antony heard Cleopatra had killed herself, so he, I guess, maybe slit his wrists or something. And then one of the two. One of them thought the other one was dead. Let me see if I have it on here. Octavian's troops, they surrounded Alexandria. So after Octavian defeated them, he goes all the way down through Palestine. He finally comes into Egypt, and he surrounds Alexandria. Mark Antony commits suicide, and then she committed suicide by allowing a poisonous snake or drinking poison or whatever. So both of them committed suicide. That's the famed love story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, right? But that's all the background. And then after this happens, you've got Octavian, who then returns up to Rome. And he goes to the Senate and says, all the enemies of Rome, all the threats have been defeated. I turn my power back over to the Senate, right? If you're the Senate, what are you thinking? Wow. You have the army behind you. You're basically the ruler. And the Senate, I think, is probably pretty impressed by it. And they actually turn right back around and say, no, we want you to be our first ruler. And that's how Octavian becomes the very first emperor of Rome, right? So that's what I think it's talking about in the history, world history, if you look at the text. So it says it'll come against him with many ships. In the notes, I have a link if you want to go look and read about the Battle of Actium. But let me look at my notes. I have how many ships it has. Let me scroll down. Rome responded, Octavian. Octavian then declared war on Egypt and Mark Antony. Mark Antony and Cleopatra decided to do their fighting mostly in a naval battle and moved north to Actium. Rome responded with chariots, horsemen, and 480 ships. Cleopatra and Antony had 480 ships, right? That's a lot of ships, you know? I don't know if you think back then, well, they didn't have a navy, so let's see. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. They didn't have a navy, so maybe they had 30 or 40 ships, right? They had 480 ships, according to one historian, okay? Let me find, it says how many, the army consisted of, this is Antony's forces, Mark Antony, 63,000 men with light armor, 12,000 horsemen, and their fleet had 480 ships, okay? Octavian had 80,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, 3,000 archers, and over 400 ships, okay? And I have the fact that Octavian's army was these really light, fast ships. These were big, strong ships. And their light ships had these harpoons that they would shoot into the wood, and then they would ram the ships with, once they had them hooked, they couldn't get away, and they'd basically break up these big ships. I have all this in the notes if you want to read more. It's really fascinating world history, right? Okay, so look at verse 41. He shall enter into the glorious land. So after all of this, that's all caught up in that one verse in verse 40, he defeats them, and he goes down through where? Palestine, okay? He goes down through Palestine, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. So after Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and they went down to Egypt, he comes through the Holy Land, conquering pretty much everybody, except for, according to Josephus, guess who? Edom, Moab, and Ammon, which are the three mentioned in Daniel 11:41, right? So it seems to fit with world history. Okay, so after Rome wins that battle, they come down through the Holy Land, okay, and then they go all the way down through over to Egypt. And then, look at verse 42. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, the land of Egypt will not escape. He went down and conquered Egypt. Verse 43. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. So after Octavian went through the Holy Land and went to Egypt, guess what? He kept going, right? And conquered more of these lands, okay? Look at verse 44. I have way more things in the notes, but for time's sake, I'm trying to just cover, the 35,000-foot view. Verse 44. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Who's the king of the north now? Rome, right? So news from the east and north shall trouble him. He will go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. Rome basically just kept conquering what? Everybody. They kept conquering everybody. I mean, they really did. They were the world power, right? So Rome is still conquering power, conquering the world. Many nations came against Rome, but they all fell, okay? This is where I have my notes. Octavian, now convinced all the threats to Rome had been eliminated, handed his power back over to the Senate, who then turned around and gave him the name Augustus, which meant illustrious one. And this is how Octavian became Augustus Caesar, the first of the Roman Caesars, okay? So this is the establishment of the first Roman emperor with the fourth great kingdom, Octavian Augustus Caesar, okay? Verse 45. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end and no one will help him. In the notes I have, while Rome would conquer and rule between the seas and even over Jerusalem, one day they would come to an end and no one would help them against God, who would bring them to an end one day, which I believe is what the book of Revelation is fulfilling, because Revelation, it uses a lot of language from Daniel, and it also speaks about the destruction of Rome, okay? All right. Now, this is going to move us into chapter 12, okay? Any questions about Daniel chapter 11? Like I said last week, in my opinion, this is one of the hardest to, I guess, maybe teach, but also to understand, because if you don't slow down and look at world history, it's really pretty confusing. I mean, it's still sort of confusing when you have to go through it, right? King of the North and King of the South and all these different things. But I think it's pretty clear when you look at world history. And pretty much, how hard is it for Bible commentators to agree on something? pretty hard. And pretty much everybody agrees Daniel 11, at least through the first 35 verses, are talking about Persia, Greece, and then the Seleucids and the Ptolemies of Egypt. So there's pretty much agreement on that. When you get to the last 10 verses, a lot of people either say, well, it's the Antichrist, which is not even remotely in the context. Some people say, oh, this is Antiochus Epiphanes, and they'll even admit, yeah, but if I take this view, I can't back it up. No world history matches really, right? And then you have Rome, which I think is the right view, which I think fits perfectly with all the things that are said. Okay. Look at chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1 says, at that time. At what time? What's the context? Who's the ruling nation at this time we just finished talking about? Rome, okay? So context is key. At that time. At what time? The time we're just discussing, the time of Rome, okay? At that time. So I think it's talking about the time of the Roman emperors. Don't lose the context based off of the chapter divisions. Were those inspired, or were they what? Added by men. That's right. They were added later, okay? So at that time, all right, chapter 12. We've just finished talking about Rome, and we're going to look at these events that I believe is culminating in AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem. Why? Because Jesus uses language like identical to what is used in this chapter. He even talks about the prophet Daniel in Matthew 24, okay? So let's look at Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, okay? Remember in Daniel chapter 10, what did we see in that chapter that was kind of odd? Remember, he comes to Daniel and he says, you've been praying for 21 days, and I came when you started praying, but I've been held up for 21 days by what? The prince of Persia. And then he said, none stood with me except, basically, I needed help from who? Michael, the archangel, right? And we talked about, is it figurative language, or does it sort of seem in some realm we don't know about? Providentially, it seems like angel, at that time, an angel was watching over Israel, right? Now, here you have in chapter 12 and verse 1, at that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, okay? And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation. What nation are we talking about? Nation of Israel, right? Rome, yeah, at the time, we're talking about Rome, but you're right. The nation of, okay, it's talking to Daniel, nation of Israel, okay? Even to that time. And at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who's found written in that book, all right? Somebody look up in your Bible. If you have your Bible at home, look that up too. But someone look up Matthew chapter 24. I believe it's verse 21. Matthew 24:21. And tell me if this doesn't sound just like Daniel 12:1. Matthew 24:21.
Been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be.
Okay, so there's going to be a time of great tribulation that's never been before and will never be after. Daniel 12:1 in the middle. There shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation even to that time. Does this sound sort of similar? I think this is what Jesus is referencing, right? I think he's basically saying, hey, remember that thing Daniel wrote about? I'm about to tell you more about it. That more information is Matthew 24, which is describing the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, right? It says, even at that time, I think it's talking about AD 70, your people will be delivered. What do you mean the Jews were delivered at AD 70, right? If the people, as you see the rest of this chapter is going to talk about, if people were wise and they were listening to what Daniel wrote and they listened to what Jesus said, would they have been delivered, yes or no? Of course they would. Even if they're Jews? Yeah, of course. If you listen to Jesus and you listen to Daniel, you'd be delivered, right? Now, if you chose to reject what Jesus said, like a lot of the Jews, what's going to happen to you when Rome comes? You're going to be destroyed, right? That's what Matthew 24 says. Hey, when these signs happen, get out of town, right? Even if it's on the Sabbath, right? Even if it's in the winter, hurry up and move, okay? That's what Matthew 24 is talking about. All right. Look at verse 2. I have a lot more notes. I mean, maybe a page of notes for that verse that we just don't have time to go through. I think that we can cover at least the 25,000-foot view and make sense of it. Okay, verse 2. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, is everyone familiar with what's called realized eschatology or the AD 70 movement or Max Kingism, right? This is a group of guys who believe that in AD 70, the final resurrection already happened, right? They believe in AD 70 that the final resurrection of the just and the unjust happened, and they'll debate about this. I guess right now, Don Preston is probably one of the biggest proponents of it, okay? Drew Leonard spoke on the South Haven Lectureship about this specific topic. These guys, I don't really feel like I've talked much about it anymore. I haven't heard much out of them. David Hester and Drew Leonard debated them, and I think Drew did a pretty good job of putting that argument down in some of his debates, and he wrote a book about it. But they take verses like this and say, hey, look, the text is talking about the power of the holy people being broken, which would happen in what? AD 70. And then you have this verse that talks about the resurrection, right? Therefore, this must be... Now, is that the main thrust of this text? No. The main thrust of this text is giving you, hey, you're going to face persecution. AD 70, the temple is going to be destroyed. Those who are faithful are going to do what? They're going to be saved, right? So you see a lot of this resurrection language used all over the Old Testament, right? Sometimes it's speaking of figurative things, like in Ezekiel 37, right? But this is not talking about the literal end of time judgment that happened in AD 70, right? It's just accommodative language. Okay, it's talking about there's going to be a judgment. Those who are faithful are going to be rewarded. Okay, I got way more notes that if you want to read further. If you have questions about this, get the notes, read through it, and then let me know. Of course, we can talk before you read all the notes, but I think it'll help sort of go through this is what this view is, this is why I don't think it lines up. This is the second view. Go to verse 3. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament. Is that literal language or figurative? Yeah, it's figurative. And those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. That's one reason I don't think it's the final judgment. Because after the final judgment, there's going to be no opportunity to turn many to righteousness, right? This is language, Matthew 13, the parable of the wheat and tares. This is how it ends. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father, all right? Jesus used this language, just like the Old Testament prophets did, okay? Verse 4. So the first three verses are saying there's going to come a time of persecution. Those who are faithful are going to be what? Rewarded, yeah. Those who are not, what? They're going to be punished. It's that simple, right? Verse 4, but you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. So he says, Daniel needs to seal this book and shut up the words. Why? It's not going to happen right now, right? It's going to happen, 400 or 500 years in the future, right? Ironically, when you get to the book of Revelation, John has a vision. He's told not to seal it up because his vision is what? Soon. Right? It's common language. That's why, I'm going to be gone the next 2 Sundays, but when I come back, we're going to start Revelation. And you're going to see a lot of parallels, right? I really think studying Daniel before Revelation is going to help make a lot of sense of this figurative language. Okay? Yes, sir.
We need to keep in mind, God is moving in a panoramic way here,
Yes.
and it's to accomplish his eternal purpose. He's letting us know all these things that are going to take place, the different judgments that he's going to bring. It's not the end of time judgments, it's different judgments throughout time. And this confuses people, like you said, but it's his eternal purpose that we have, and he's using all these different events to carry out what he has in mind. He's letting us know ahead of time so that we can remain faithful, so that we can, not be intimidated by all these things that are taking place, and to be faithful unto death. And so I think if we keep that in mind, that this is God letting us know what's coming up. And then, a lot of these things have already taken place, of course. But then as you're going to go into Revelation now, the same thing for us to be faithful unto death. And the faithful will conquer, we will be victorious.
That's a great point. Yeah, what Joe basically said is, look, this is just God he knows everything, right? He sees everything at once, the beginning to the end, right? Jesus was the lamb slain before the what? Foundation of the world. That wasn't a surprise to God. He knew that was going to happen, okay? So what Joe is saying is, look, this is a promise to these people. Be faithful and you'll be rewarded. When we think about persecution, let's say there's persecution that starts in America 50 days from now, or 50 years from now, whatever. What book are we going to be talking about? Revelation, right? Be faithful unto death, right? What about these people back then when they're in Babylonian captivity, right? They have a similar message in Daniel, which is persecution is going to come, but if you're faithful, what's going to happen? Yeah, you're going to be delivered, all right? So that's 9:45. Wow, all right. That's the end of class. I'll put a note in here. I'm going to start, I'll film a video this week, and then I'll add it to the YouTube playlist. And I'll just go through chapter 12, verse 4, all the way through the end of the book. If you have any questions, come talk to me. There's a sign-up list on the back that is still there. Just add your email to it if you want the notes, and I'll send it to you along with the PowerPoints and that sort of thing. So, all right, thanks for your attention this quarter, and I'll be gone the next 2 weeks, but I'll see you back in 3 weeks.